Hello, welcome to this revision session regarding early Elizabethan England, regarding key topic 1, Queen, Government and Religion from 1558 to 1569. In today's content, we're going to be looking at this part of the specification regarding the situation on Elizabeth's accession, looking at the Elizabethan England in 1558 with regards to the society at the time and the government, and looking at the problems and challenges facing Queen Elizabeth when she came onto the throne, including her legitimacy, gender, marriage, and as well as challenges at home and from abroad. Before we begin this course, we require some form of context with regards to the Tudors. So Elizabeth was the daughter of Henry VIII and also of Anne Boleyn, who was the second wife of Henry VIII. She succeeded Mary, who is otherwise known as Bloody Mary, when she died in 1558. And during this whole period of time, Tudor England had seen a lot of religious changes dating back to the break with Rome in the 1530s, with Henry VIII changing the religion from Catholicism to Protestantism. Elizabeth was Protestant, but always unlikely to have taken the throne due to Edward VI, who died young at the age of 15, and Mary, who was unable to give birth to any children. So today's session is going to be looking at the situation on Elizabeth's accession. So the way that society looked at this point in time is displayed in this diagram. It is pretty much based on the old feudal system that was introduced by William the Conqueror and the Normans. And everyone seemed to have a clear idea of where everyone belonged. So at the top you had the nobility, you then had the gentry, where people had titles and a huge amount of land, yeomen, tenant farmers, landless and labouring poor, and vagrants and homeless. Your place in society was basically determined by how much land you had, and whether or not you owned the land or whether it was rented. With the amount of land that you owned, you evidently had more wealth, and therefore you had more power in that respect. In terms of where the population lived, 90% lived and worked in the countryside, with 10% living in newly formed towns. Within the towns, it was based on the idea of occupations. At the top of the tree were merchants, and they often owned a lot of property, because these merchants would sell commodities via their trade routes. So, for example, the main thing that was being traded at this time was English cloth, and that was traded primarily with Europe, in particular the Netherlands. In terms of the structure of government, there's a significant power structure, and again, it's based on the idea of a hierarchy. With regards to the monarch had powers of being able to declare war and make peace, as well as accepting or rejecting laws that were passed by Parliament. She could also give titles to people and land to people to curry favour, and that was known as patronage. So, for example, everyone within the gentry and nobility were either placed there historically or were given these titles by the sitting monarch. The Privy Council are a key core group of advisors that would advise the monarch on government policy and would carry out the decisions that are made by Elizabeth herself. The most important person at this point would be the Secretary of State, and during the Elizabethan period that we're discussing, it was held by Sir William Cecil. In terms of Parliament is made up of two houses as it is today. However, the House of Lords were representatives of the rich and powerful, and carried a lot more power than what they have done in the 21st century. The House of Commons are representatives of the common people. They are able to pass laws, and they were able to grant extraordinary taxation. That is taxation where funds are raised in order to fight a war. Towards the bottom of the scale, you've got local government and you've got justices of the peace, which are still used today, otherwise known as magistrates. They ensured that policies were carried out at the local level and were there to ensure that the law and order was established in the localities in which they served. So one of the problems with Elizabeth when she came onto the throne was her legitimacy. It was obviously in doubt. It was in doubt because of her father's divorce of Catherine of Aragon in 1533 in order to marry Anne Boleyn, who was Elizabeth's mother. The divorce was due to the hope of having a male heir to carry on the Tudor dynasty. Catherine of Aragon was very old at this point and had had a series of miscarriages and stillbirths, and any male child that was born did not survive past a year. Because of her age, Anne Boleyn was a lot more fertile and was seen as a future mother to the King of England. In terms of the further issues of legitimacy, Henry wished to divorce Catherine of Aragon to marry Anne Boleyn, and the only way that you could do that under the Catholic religion at this point was to be granted a special order from the Pope. As the Pope refused to grant this divorce, this led to the break with Rome in the 1530s and the setting up of the Church of England under a doctrine of Protestantism. This became a problem for Elizabeth at the start of her reign for three main reasons. One is that those that were committed to the Catholic faith did not acknowledge the divorce because the Pope, their leader, had not agreed to it. Catherine of Aragon was still alive when Elizabeth was born, and thereby that made her illegitimate. And Elizabeth was originally removed from the line of succession after the birth of Edward VI, but Henry VIII reversed his decision later on, but the impact of this was it heightened the legitimacy further. The second problem that Elizabeth faced was to do with her gender. It was very unusual for a woman to rule on her own during this time period. Only Mary I had done so beforehand, which was obviously the previous monarch. But during that reign, things had not gone well. Mary had lost a war against France. The finances had taken a significant hit because of the war, and therefore that had a massive impact on society and the economy. The marriage to Philip II of Spain led to the Wyatt Rebellion, and Mary was also responsible for the burning of up to 300 people for their religious beliefs. So the role of gender was a problem for Elizabeth because Christian religion taught that women should be under the authority of men. It was therefore expected that Elizabeth was to marry a man so that the man would then become king and would take over the running of the country. Other issues would suggest that monarchs were still expected to lead their armies into battle, and women were not akin to fighting in wars at this time, and women were also considered to be weak and incapable of governing. This leads on to the problem of marriage, as many people felt that Elizabeth should marry in order to provide an heir. Unfortunately, she had no intention of doing so, and the suitors that were available included the King of Sweden, the Prince of Denmark, as well as her brother-in-law, Philip II of Spain. So this turns into a problem for Elizabeth because it leads to a succession issue, as without marriage there would be no suitable heir, and therefore that would lead to issues further in her reign, particularly combined with questions about her legitimacy in the event that Elizabeth died, in which she almost did with regards to a bout of smallpox early in her reign, who would actually take over from her if she did die early on. The fourth problem that was faced was to do with the threat of France. So France was wealthy and had a larger population than England and was a significant power within Europe at the time. They were also an ally of Scotland, otherwise known as the Old Alliance. Scotland were a traditional enemy of England, and the border between Scotland and England was not very well guarded and was very hard to defend. It also makes things even more complicated because French troops were stationed in Scotland for a period of time, particularly during the reign of Edward VI, and had stayed there ever since. Mary Queen of Scots, who was half Scottish and half French, had a strong claim to the throne. She was married to Francis II, the King of France, at the very beginning of Elizabeth's reign, and Mary Queen of Scots had declared herself the legitimate Catholic claimant to the English throne. This was primarily because Mary Queen of Scots was the great-granddaughter of Henry VII and had a legitimate claim to the throne based on that lineage. The other issue with regards to France is that Calais, although it is now a significant port between Dover and Calais, Calais used to belong to England, but Mary had lost that in her war with France. This is Mary I had lost that with the war with France in her reign. England felt humiliated by that particular loss, and it was a very key foreign policy aim for Elizabeth in order to regain that particular piece of land. The other issue with regards to the threat of France is that the Catholic religion ruled in all of Scotland, Spain, and France. Spain and France were significant powers at this point in time in Europe, whereas Scotland had allied themselves with France. So Elizabeth was very fearful of these countries uniting in order to remove her from the throne, and they would have done so if they did actually unite. The last challenge is to do with finance. So in order to govern effectively, monarchs require money, but they can only raise it from the following areas. They can rent it from the land that they own, otherwise known as crown lands. They can tax and put levies on trade, and they can also profit from justice. Now, due to the spending of wars by Henry VIII when he invaded France, Edward VI with regards to Scotland, and Mary with regards to France once again, this led the monarchy into a huge amount of debt. The figure is around about £300,000. The annual income from the 3 bullet points above with regards to crown lands, trade, and justice was a touch under £287,000. The issue with that is that crown lands had been sold off in order to fund the wars of the previous monarchs, and therefore once you sell something off, you can no longer gain income from it through rent. So then let's move on to the idea of the biggest challenge facing Elizabeth. This can be a 16-mark question that has come up in previous exam papers. So therefore your criteria for this particular type of question as to which one is the biggest challenge would need to be the one that would prevent Elizabeth from ruling effectively. So in terms of what the biggest challenge would be, it would have to be the idea of finance. So the finance is the biggest issue under this particular criteria, purely because the amount of debt would mean it's difficult to raise funds for any wars. And anyone that would attack, say for example, France or Spain or Scotland or a combination of the three, then Elizabeth would not be able to defend the country from such an army. It would also be difficult to grant patronages to those who opposed Elizabeth to keep them on side. Don't forget that land was normally granted to people in order to incentivize them to show loyalty to the monarch. In addition to this, Parliament would not be she would not be able to use Parliament to raise extraordinary taxation, because in the 4 occasions where extraordinary taxation was granted by Parliament, on each occasion during the Tudor dynasty, it led to a rebellion, with that being the main cause. So a summary of this particular key topic: we've got Elizabeth being the second ruling Queen of England, and it was thought unnatural within society for women to rule alone. Elizabeth was highly intelligent, but could be indecisive. She was the head of the government, making all key decisions, but required her Privy Council, JPs, and Lord Lieutenants to govern effectively. The monarch was the key decision maker and would decide on, in particular, the religion of the country. And there were many threats that were faced by England, particularly from Scotland, France, and Spain. The claim to the throne was in doubt, purely because of the legitimacy issue, and that threat mainly came from Catholics who viewed Mary Queen of Scots as the rightful heir. The next video will be on the religious settlement. Please make sure that you like and subscribe so that you can get notifications on when these videos are uploaded.